Welcome, everyone. This is the 210 presentation on deploying two-factor to millions of users. Please join me in welcoming Emanuele here to have his presentation. I'm really looking forward to this one, so take it away.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Is anyone here building or planning two-factor authentication? Oh, wow. Oh, more hands than I thought. Right, so one of my first projects at Pinterest was to build two-factor authentication. And between design, implementation, deployment, I think I've been spending quite a few months just thinking about this space. And during these months, I learned about FIDO2. I got really excited about hardware security keys. And then something magic happened. On one side, I had this experience, this inspiration from my job that deploying 2FA and feeling empowered to protect so many users. And on the other hand, I sort of realized there was no open source alternative to hardware security keys. And so together with a group of friends, we co-founded Solo Keys, where we are making Solo. Solo is this little security key. It's open source, and it's the first one to implement FIDO2. And today, I think there is another exciting thing. Solo is probably the biggest key you have ever seen. Oh, that's impressive. But yeah, back to the talk. So today, what I would like to do is to share my journey at Pinterest with you and what we learn on deploying two-factor authentication. And so this is going to be our agenda for today. After an introduction and a design, we are going to focus on the two main flows that are logging and enable two-factor authentication. And then we're going to end with some juicy details. So I always like to start with a definition. So two-factor authentication is an authentication method where the user is granted access after she presents two or more pieces of evidence, also known as the factor. So why do we want two-factor authentication? I think there are two kinds of users, the good users, for which 2FA is a way to protect their account. And then we also have the bad users, those that reuse their password, their account gets compromised, and then they complain to us, to the company. And so for us as a company, 2FA is also safeguard. In a way, we can go back to those users and say, hey, there is an instrument, please use it the next time. Of course, 2FA has also some cons. User can be locked out. And so while you build two-factor authentication, you definitely want to engage with your growth and support team, because those are going to be the team that will handle bugs and user complaints. So authentication factors, they are organized in three, something you know, something you have, something you are. And I think there is a little bit of mismatch between what we learn at school and what we have in practice. So the first factor is usually a password or a social login or maybe a link sent via email that proves that the user owns something. The second factor, so we have codes. Codes can be sent via SMS, TOTP, or even backup codes. And the reason I put them towards something you know is that codes are short. And they are short for a reason, because the user needs to remember those even for a little amount of time. And because of that, these codes are phishable. So if we really want something strong that proves the user has something, we should probably use push notification or security keys, even better. And as you can see, there is no something you are here. And this is because fingerprint and face recognition today are client-only verifications, so there is no server challenge. And so we cannot really use them for implementing two-factor authentication. And by the way, please absolutely don't send biometrics data to any server, because if you do so, you go to hell. So let's see the design. So how do we build two-factor authentication? Well, we mentioned already we have login and enable flows. And enable is typically buried in the settings, so only some user can find it. So less problem for us. The critical point is that typically, at least in a bigger organization, these two flows can be owned by different teams. And so you will have to engage and to keep both of them synchronized. Both require implementation on the backend and API. Luckily, well, the login, of course, you must have it on every single platform you support. Luckily, the enable you can choose. For example, at Pinterest, we choose web only. Someone else, like for example, Instagram, I think they did mobile only, so it's really up to you. For us, whenever there is a product feature that is visible to user, we have to engage also with the design team. And in this case, because it's international, also the internationalization team. And finally, my recommendation is, given the size of this project, you should also try to engage with the marketing and PR such that you can get the best out of your project. This is going to be the high-level architecture we are going to use. So we have clients API and a user service or database, and these all need some sort of minor modification to support 2FA. And then there is going to be a service, either it's a microservice or a complete service that implements the 2FA specific logic, for example, generation of the codes and verification. At Pinterest, in terms of clients, we have Android, iOS, and web. Well, our API is an API. And the user service, typically we have 3 Java services internally and backed by MySQL database. In terms of two-factor authentication service, we chose to partner with an external service, which is Auth by Twilio. Okay, so if I were to go back and build 2FA again, I would definitely start from logging. And so the idea being I could fake some data and pretend some user already enabled 2FA, and then I can implement logging. And the reason seems pretty straightforward, but it wasn't evident to me when we built it, that logging is a must on every single platform. And on some platform, especially on mobile, the deployment cycle can be slower than web and API. In addition, we made a choice to only support codes. And because of that, we can only implement a single login screen. And so that simplifies a little bit both the user experience and the implementation. This is our experience today, and thanks to Auth, we can have essentially 2 experiences in one. On the left side, on your left side, you can see the SMS. On the right side, you see the user that has installed the Auth app will receive a push notification and will grab the code from the Auth app. This was particularly important, I think, for us because we use a lot push notification for, let's say, social reasons. And so mixing social and security is not really a great idea for user experience. And it's not showing this representation, but also the same screen supports backup code. So if the code is not 7-digit, which is the Auth standard, then it's a backup code, and we support also that one. So in order to implement two-factor authentication, we need, on one end, to modify existing login endpoints, and on the other end, to create a new one to verify the second factor. So this is an example of modifying an existing endpoint. So the client, will send the credential to the API. The API will verify the credential. At that point, if the user passes the first authentication, then we can check with the user service whether he has two-factor authentication enabled, and then in parallel send the code through the 2FA service and return an exception for one two-factor authentication required. At that point, the client will show the 2FA screen, and after the user inputs, the client will send the code is verified, and an OK is returned to the user. So in our experience, the backend is relatively smooth in the sense, you have to implement API endpoint, but that's what you do basically every single day. The front end is where we had the issues. The issue, so in principle, it seems easy because you have to catch an exception and show the 2FA screen. The problem is this exception is typically caught very deep in the network stack. And so based on how many engineers have been working on your network stack, how old is that network stack, and especially who's working now on two-factor authentication, you may encounter difficulties. So in order to roll out properly, what we did was, so that's what we do always, we gate all new code behind experiments. We have a solid experiment framework that we use to roll out progressively every single new feature. We typically deploy to employee first so that we can have some internal testing before release to the public. And finally, we were monitoring for unexpected regressions. And that's unfortunately happened in our case. So in our case, Android went out. And despite there were no user with two-factor authentication, the new code was causing issues with the Facebook login on Android. And yeah, so because of that, we had to close the experiment, wait for a new release, and 1 month passes very quickly. So this is why I highly recommend focusing on having a solid login experience as soon as you can. So next, we are going to talk about the enable two-factor authentication. The idea is to have this option in the settings where the user can enable two-factor authentication. So my tip here is it's a relatively smooth process. It's a flow, but many engineers in your company are used to implement flows. Don't waste time in little details. For example, there are chances to spend hours and hours deciding what's the best number formatting, what are the country codes that you have to support. So if you are the one that implements the flow, that's probably something you can focus on. But if you are relying on an external resource, I highly recommend to provide very detailed specifications so that they don't waste their time. And again, the choice is to choose your favorite platform so that you have a single point where you will roll out the 2FA feature. We have two flows actually in the enable and the disable. I leave you as an exercise to design them on the architecture. It should be pretty straightforward. But the enable, we want to absolutely verify the password before we enable 2FA. We want to input and possibly verify a phone number or scan a QR code, whatever you decide to implement. And then most importantly, you need to force the user into a fallback in case they don't have their second device. So the fallback, the typical solution is to provide randomly generated backup codes. And we know that nobody is actually printing them, but it's, again, a safeguard. In case the user lost their phone, we can say, hey, we give you the backup code. Why didn't you? Right? So on the disable, we typically in the industry verify the password. I don't know why. Technically, I think we should verify for 2FA, but nobody does that, and so we don't do it. And finally, you should never provide an override function, not even possibly to your support team, because then they tend to use it very easily. So disabling 2FA if you no longer have access to your account should be a painful process by design where you verify explicitly the identity. And so I highly recommend, if you have to build it yourself, to go through the Google or the Facebook or the Authy experience. And for example, we rely completely on Authy for that. Some little details about enable flow. So it's really important to send always security emails to the user to announce that the 2FA has been enabled or disabled. In our case, we also made a choice to implement a unique phone number in the sense that if a user has a phone number and a second user reuses the same phone number, this phone number is going to be removed from the first user. Okay? This is because we cannot assume that phone numbers don't move around. And this was, by the way, at least when we built it, the same experience that Facebook was doing. I don't know if they changed it recently, but this is, I would say, a common practice. For the rollout, well, we had an international rollout, so I highly recommend to go through the experience in a language that is not English. This is because from a user perspective, the flow is pretty complex. And so you want to make sure they can follow all the steps and they don't have weird messages half in their language, half in English. And finally, my recommendation, even if you do a big launch, maybe with press, maybe with a big marketing push, roll out very slowly, because any possible error in a security feature can cause a big blow up. And so if you look, not just for Pinterest, but also for Instagram, Facebook, when they launch two-factor authentication, you see that the message is always something like, we are starting to roll out 2FA, or we're starting to deploy 2FA in the coming weeks or months. Okay, so I highly recommend to go slow and make it and do it well. And now the juicy details. So the first question often we have is, what do we have to protect with two-factor? Like, of course, we want to protect the user login with username and password, but many other things are kind of a question mark. And so we kind of try to give a universal answer, thinking to 2FA as a contract that we do with the user. And in this contract, we tell the user, if you enable 2FA, we'll never get you ATO'd again. And because of that, essentially, we want to protect with 2FA every single point in our stack where we generate a new access token. And so literally what I did was to grab generate access token or the equivalent function in our code base and figure out what were this endpoint. And for example, I found some API endpoint of old login, like for example with Twitter, that were not in use. And so this rule allowed us to to protect consistently across the board. One important one is the password reset. So to reset the password, the user should verify 2FA. And another big one, I think, is social login. So in Pinterest, if you log in with Facebook or Google, you are going to be requested two-factor authentication, again, for the motivation we mentioned before. There is also a user experience motivation, if you like. So imagine the user that enables two-factor authentication, and then they want to test it. So they log out, and they try to log in again. And so you cannot expect in that moment that they are going to use username and password. Maybe they just use Facebook because it's more convenient. And so at that specific time, they are waiting for 2FA that they are eager to test. Yeah, so one possible optimization would be nice, in my opinion, if we could know if the user has two-factor authentication enabled on the social, on Google or Facebook, but unfortunately, the OAuth specification doesn't support that. So yeah, maybe in the near future. Security keys. So today you heard already about security key. That's amazing. FIDO2 also protects against phishing, not only account takeover, and also, as you know now, there are also open source security keys. So how cool is that? As you heard today, Web10 is a standard, so that's really exciting. Almost every major browser today has support. So it's really a good time to build support for security keys. And on mobile, the situation is a little bit different, so it can require a little bit more work on your side, especially in iOS. Android is moving forward pretty fast. So let's assume we built two-factor authentication on with the codes only, and now we want to implement security keys. So what we have to do is a new screen where we also allow the user to change the 2FA method. And that's for sure what we need on web. On mobile, that's a big question. Again, it requires more involvement and more resources. And so it turns out that, to the best of my knowledge, at least only Google supports security keys on mobile, and also companies like Facebook prefer to force you into a push notification or a OTP code. And finally, for the enable, it's really important to support multiple keys per user, so not unlike AWS. And again, to support, to force a fallback method. And so if you have to choose, I highly recommend to look for Facebook experience, because I think it's really well done. So let's predict the future for a second. You're going to have bugs. Where are these bugs? So I think the enable, you're not going to likely change it a lot. And so you can expect essentially it's bug-free, which is great. On the login side instead, login is going to change a lot because new feature, new login method that offer even better growth experiences. And so the problem is that those people in the company might be newer and they may not know everything about two-factor authentication. In our experience, enforcing that every new endpoint is protected from two-factor authentication was relatively easy because security could monitor for new endpoints. The vice versa, assuming that every new screen is going to properly work, so it's going to properly display, and it's going to properly send the code and verify, was not really the case. And so we had a bunch of bugs in this experience, and so I think you should keep an eye on those. And in my opinion, there is not really a very good solution. It's just about constantly educate your developer, and especially the new one, about the fact that 2FA exists. And yeah, we'll see in the next slide another thing. So marketing and PR. It seems that this is, I think you all agree, this is a pretty solid and big project, especially for the security team that typically doesn't interact a lot in the product. And so I think it's really important to market internally by showcasing. For example, we do brown bags, and we also have a 1-minute demo where we can showcase whatever we built in front of the entire company. And then it's highly recommended to employees to enable 2FA. And again, if you think to the newer employees and the growth team, they can at least know that the 2FA exists. And by the way, I'm super excited to share that our CEO, Ben Silberman, has 2FA enabled on his Pinterest account, so it's pretty cool. And then market externally, so certainly write a tech blog post. That's pretty easy. That's on you. Company blog post, if you have one, you can connect to those people. They are typically really excited to work with technical people and to sort of write something geeky, but with a less technical voice. And in our case, for example, we released a blog post in 5 languages. That for me was especially cool because there was also Italian, and I'm from Italy. And finally, PR. PR might be hard because 2FA is no longer in use, but you can probably combine it with other security features. And so if you search for Pinterest two-factor authentication, you see that the PR message was actually a combination of multiple things that we released together. And this one finally is a slide that I copy and pasted from one of these internal showcases that I mentioned. This is just to show you how many people collaborated in the first release, and of course, many more came after that. And so in conclusion, well, I think two-factor authentication is great, but it's a big project, so put some effort in it. Login is going to give you headaches, but enable will be pretty smooth. And so my invite for you is to go and build it. And before I close, I just want to let you know that Connor, my co-founder, the Solo Keys, is here and is going to give you away some free security keys for you to try it out. And if you want more, of course, you can get as many as you want. Thank you very much.
Did you want to take questions?
Yeah,
So
if you have any questions.
Okay. Let me.
Yeah, and by the way, if you have more questions later on, I'll be at the Pinterest booth, like in the sponsor area, so feel free to. Yeah.
What was your adoption rate like, and of those people, how many opted to install an app instead of go with SNS?
Okay, so the question is what's the adoption rate and how many people decided to use Authy? So unfortunately, we don't share publicly the adoption rate. What I can tell you is that in general, there are two sets of people. One is the people that have decided to enable 2FA, and the other one is the one that we recommended because, for example, their account was taken over or we proactively protected it. And so the second part is the big bulk. So people tend to not enable 2FA by themselves, at least on Pinterest, which is sort of a personal use experience, and they prefer when they get burned, essentially. So why do we decide to build versus Authy? Yeah, so I think the decision was mostly, well, on one hand, cost, in the sense that, cost of maintenance, I would say, and also the experience that Authy adds in terms of fighting frauds against 2FA. And so, like, in a certain sense, it would be, so the maintenance part of 2FA can be more costly. The technical side, I think, is doable relatively easily, especially because there are so many open libraries that you can use. So I think for us, literally was support and maintenance in the future. This entire process of the presentation, about 6 months, including the release and the marketing. Yeah.
Security critical. By that I mean that if their account gets compromised, it's going to lead to bigger, basically, problems. So if you have such users, do you do anything different to get them to enable, to get those most critical users to enable two-factor authentication?
Yeah. So the question is whether we have a different set of users, some user high risk or high profile, and whether we do something different for them in terms of two-factor authentication. So yes, we have advertisers. So advertisers spend money in Pinterest. It's a double-edged sword because they are higher profile in the sense that they are more valuable, but they are also need to be, we need to be more careful because if you protect a Pinterest user and you lock the account, there is no financial impact. But if you protect an advertiser and you block the account, then you also lose money. So you want to trade those two things, or at least use very careful measures. In terms of 2FA, they both have access to a 2FA, and we haven't done any specific campaign to enable 2FA, but I know that that's a request that we get through the sales channel, and so essentially they are more aware, generally speaking, than the regular pinners. Thank you.
Hi, you mentioned you wanted to make it painful for support to disable this sort of, like once it is enabled for an account and not just to be like a flag they can turn off. Could you expand on what that looks like in general? Like what kind of process you have someone go through once they've lost their authenticator to turn it off?
Yes, let's say if you have Authy, you can try essentially the experience through Authy, and it's basically very similar to Google, where you say, I forgot my phone through the website, and then they go through identity verification. If the same things come like through the Pinterest support, then we essentially ask the user to enable Authy, or we tell them to go through the Authy process. One thing that happened in a single isolated case was a partner, like one of those advertisers, where someone essentially set up 2FA and then they left the company, so the new person didn't have access. In that case, because we have a direct sales channel, we essentially verified ourselves, and so we kind of bypassed, but it was really a sort of more like an exception because we knew all the steps, otherwise they go through Authy. Yeah. Do we have time?
Yeah, why don't we do it? We are at time now, so thank you all for attending. Just remember that there are still, I think they are still selling T-shirts. It goes to charity, so you can even pick which charity you want. Hack the Hood, Hackers for Charity, or EFF. Thank you very much for it. And on behalf of BSidesSF, we have a gift for you. And everybody, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.